Alright, so during my streams, I've been asked a couple times about my general experiences with Gacha. You know, stuff like what was your best or worst session rolling for a character? So to answer that, I wanted to do something a little bit different than usual and do a story time about some of the worst experiences that I've ever had rolling in Gacha games. Maybe you'll find it fun to listen to, or I don't know, maybe you can laugh along at some of my misfortunes. Whenever I reminisce about this kind of thing, there's 3 scenarios that immediately come to mind, but first I want to lay some groundwork. Starting off, it's probably worth mentioning the kind of gacha player I am. I am definitely not someone who's free to play. Like, I've spent money on pretty much every gacha I've played for more than a few months, but I also wouldn't consider myself someone who wails out for every character or anything like that. Generally, I'd say I'm pretty picky with who I roll for, and that can sometimes leave me with a large pool of free currency to use if it's been a while between rolling sessions. So, while some of these scenarios might seem bad on paper, in terms of actual real-life money spent, they're not always that bad financially. That being said, they never really felt great, and that's basically the angle I want to go at these worst experiences from, because how the session felt is the most important factor for me. Anyway, the first rolling session I want to talk about is from Genshin Impact, which I'm sure is more than a few people's first gacha. In Genshin, one of my favorite characters is Kazuha, and he's also one of the 3 5-star characters that I've C6'd in that game.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
For those of you unfamiliar with Kazuha, he's a character of the Anemo or wind element that was intended to be a support character that boosts his teammates' elemental damage. But if you got a second copy of him, he would get an extra charge of his skill, which meant that you could sort of run him as a DPS if you really wanted to. This really appealed to me, but running him as a DPS wasn't considered super viable at the time, especially because the game didn't really have any supports that boosted Kazuha's elemental damage. Eventually though, my prayers were answered, and a 4-star character called Faruzan released in 3.3 to support a new 5-star DPS character called Wanderer, both of which who have the same element as Kazuha does. Despite Faruzan releasing alongside Wanderer, she basically catapulted the entire Anemo element into relevancy just because of the buffs that she gave the team. And what that meant is that Faruzan would work really well for any Anemo character, including Kazuha. Like, not only does she have both Anemo resistance shred and Anemo damage bonus baked into her kit, but depending on how many constellations you add for her, she would also buff Anemo crit damage. The downside to all that is that without constellations, her build requirements are extremely high, requiring nearly 300% energy recharge to consistently ult, which wasn't really easy to hit. Now, because I was a fan of Kazuha, and more importantly because I wanted to play him as a DPS, I knew that I needed to not only get her for my account, but I'd likely have to go all the way to C6 for him to be optimal. And despite 4-stars not having any kind of guarantee or pity in Genshin, I'd never really had any bad luck going for them before, so I figured, what's the worst that could happen? So when that banner came around, I started rolling. I do 1 10 pull, nothing, alright, no big deal. Another, still nothing, alright, it is what it is. 30 rolls, 40 rolls, 50, 60, 70, 80 rolls. Oh, wait a minute, I hit a 5-star and I got the new banner character Wanderer without even getting a single copy of Faruzan. So now, I was in a dilemma of deciding whether or not I wanted to roll more. I knew that if I wanted to run Kazuha as a DPS, I needed Faruzan, and the new character Wanderer wasn't really that amazing without her either. But, having gotten a copy of him already, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to continue rolling. After thinking about it for a bit, I decided to go for it. 1 10 pull later, and what do you know, immediately another 5-star, and it was Wanderer again. Now it's a really weird situation, right? Like, the reason I'm rolling was for a 4-star, yet somehow I'd gotten a 5-star that I wasn't super invested in, and twice nonetheless. At this point, it probably would have been a good idea to stop, but I was like, it can't be that bad, right? So another 10 pull, and another, and another, and another, all the way up to 170 pulls on the banner, and finally, 1 copy of Faruzan. But remember, this is a character that has insane build requirements, and I also wanted to max her out, so I couldn't stop there. I needed her to work with Kazuha. 1 more 10 pull, and another, and this one had a 5-star, which I lost a 50-50 on this time. So that puts me at 3 5-stars in comparison to just 1 copy of the 4-star character I was actually rolling for. Normally, I'd probably stop there. At the very least, I got the character, and I definitely got my values worth in terms of 5-stars, so it would be the smart thing to do. So anyway, I kept rolling, all the way up until finally, a 10 pull away from my next 5-star, I get a roll with 2 4-stars, and boom! Both are Faruzan! Now I've gotten 2 copies of the rate up 5-star, 1 random 5-star, and 3 of Faruzan. We're somewhat back in business, but still, it's a 4-star. Why is it taking so many rolls? So I kept rolling, and I got another copy of Wanderer, but still no more Faruzan. I rolled again and again, but despite getting a couple more copies of her before hitting the next 5-star, it still wasn't enough to max her out. And then, another copy of Wanderer hit the account. I kept going because I was in way too deep to stop, and then I lost the next 50-50. At this point, I was desperate. I needed to finish the max Faruzan. Also, my favorite character, Kazuha, could finally become a real DPS. I rolled and rolled and rolled some more, all the way to one more 5-star, and finally, with a C4 Wander and 2 lost 50/50s on my plate, I finally had a C6 Faruzan. That's right, after all those rolls, I was somehow sitting tied with 7 5-stars compared to just 7 copies of the 4-star character I was actually rolling for. A normal person might have been happy they got a ton of 5-stars, but for me, I was honestly just baffled. Remember, I'm basically considering these different scenarios based on how they felt, and this one definitely didn't feel great. I didn't really want the copies of Wander I got, though don't get me wrong, it was nice to have them. All of those rolls were for something entirely different, and honestly, it just sucked to have to go that hard on rolling just to actually get the thing I did want. It felt pretty reminiscent of some of the older gachas that didn't really have pities or anything else, which felt abnormal considering Genshin's whole thing with a 50/50 guarantee for 5-stars was a way to improve on those old systems. So there I was with a C4 Wander and my C6 Faruzan, feeling kinda bad about it. But I figured at this point, I already went deep enough to get a C4, so I might as well finish the C6 because I'd never done that before anyway.
Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it.
And here's the real kicker of the entire story. I ended up winning both 50/50s to get C5 and C6 in around 160 rolls or so. And during those last 160 pulls, I got 9 copies of Faruzan. The game had to have been messing with me that day, and it is definitely something that's stuck with me ever since. But that's not actually the only story I have like this, because it's happened in another gacha I play called FGO as well. For those of you that don't know anything about FGO, it's a turn-based gacha that's based around the Fate IP, you know, the one that's getting a collab with HSR in a few months. FGO is definitely an old school game, which means it comes with a lot of the pitfalls that old gachas have, like information being hidden behind tons of menus or not even being in the game at all, relatively long and drawn out combat stages with no autoplay or skip function, and a lot of grinding to do if you want to make your characters and your account as a whole stronger. But the worst thing the game had back then when this scenario happened was no pity for its gacha. Yep, you heard that right. The thing that all newer gachas have that lets you guarantee what you want as long as you save enough for it, well, it just didn't exist back then. To be clear, it does now, but not at the time the incident happened. Despite not having a pity, FGO rates aren't actually the worst in comparison to stuff like the Hoyo system. The actual chance of getting a 5-star is 1%, which is a bit higher than the Hoyo version, and it's not a 50/50 either. Originally, it was a 70/30 and later increased to an 80/20, but at this time, it was still a 70/30. So while no pity is bad, statistically, you're actually likely to hit the 5-star you're rolling for within a bit over 100 rolls or so. But statistics, they're known to exclude outliers, and boy was I an outlier in this case. The character I was rolling for here was a character from the caster class called Skadi, and at the time she was essentially the premier support you wanted to get on your account, because otherwise you were kinda bricked. If you remember earlier, I said there's no autoplay in this game, so when you're farming stages, generally you want to clear them as quickly as possible. The reason Skadi was so good is that she enabled what the community calls looping for pretty much whoever had her. Looping basically means gigabuffing your DPS with Skadi, using your ultimate, and then refunding enough ultimate charge from damaging the enemy that you could use your ultimate again on the next wave of enemies. Without Skadi, this was actually still possible to do, but you needed much more specific setups. So what Skadi did was make it more accessible. As a result of this, when her banner came around, I wanted her, not just because she enabled gameplay mechanics, but also, I mean, hey, she's cute. Unfortunately for me, her banner came right after a few other characters I also rolled for, so going into her banner, I didn't really have that much free currency to my name. If I'm remembering right, like at the time I think I had around 100 rolls or so, which again, statistically meant I had a decent shot of getting her. As one last bit of context, if you're not aware of how FGO rolling works, they actually have a spook system, which means that you don't always see stuff like the gold flash of a meteor in Genshin or an iridescent ticket like in HSR. Sometimes a card might show up as silver and then spark to turn gold, which could mean a 4 or a 5-star. Sometimes a card could be double-sided and then that means it's a guarantee that it'll spark. And other times the usually white orbs that show the summoning will be gold to denote higher rarity, or even rainbow, which means you are guaranteed to get a 5-star. So the banner shows up and I started rolling, and literally the very first roll has gold orbs and a gold caster card appears. I'm like, no way, did I really get her that easily? Then the card turns over and it's a 4-star instead. Realistically, after seeing that, I should have known what was to come and maybe not just rolled. But again, this is a character that you kind of really wanted to progress your account at the time, so I kept rolling. Multiple rolls go by and I hit gold again. It's a 5-star this time and I get Achilles. I'm like, okay, that's disappointing, especially because he was someone I rolled earlier in the year, but that wasn't enough for me to stop. I kept rolling, getting some 4-stars along the way, and eventually I hit another 5-star. This time it was Artoria, or Saber as most people know her. I rolled more, and then I got another 5-star in Kidu this time. At this point, I'm starting to get a bit concerned. I'd run out of the free currency I had when I started, and this is where I was beginning to dip into real money to buy packs. But this was by no means the first time I'd spent money on FGO, because again, it had no pity, so getting unlucky sometimes was to be expected. On top of that, even if I wasn't getting Skadi, at the very least, I was still getting something for my troubles, so I kept going. John showed up. I'm deep at this point, but I still roll more. A second Achilles shows up. I keep going, and I get a copy of Drake. At this point, I'm starting to lose my mind, because remember here, this is a game that doesn't have 50-50s. I'd lost the 70-30 6 times in a row at this point, which literally has a 0.073% chance of happening, and I'd also gotten a boatload of 4-stars along the way. Like, I couldn't believe this. Why was I the one getting so unlucky here? Surely if I kept rolling, it would all turn around, right? Like, there may be no pity, but in the back of my mind, I was still somewhat believing that Skadi might come soon, so I rolled again, and I got a second copy of Enkidu, putting me at a 0.022% chance of this happening. I was very deep into the wallet for this one, and it was becoming painful. At this point, I felt like I had to give up. I felt like I'd reached a dead end without any light ahead of me because again, there was no pity. But after a few days deliberation just before the banner ended, I decided to buy one more pack, and what happened next gave me the wildest roller coaster of emotions I think I've ever had while rolling in a gacha game. I did my first 10 roll, and as expected at this point, I got nothing, but I couldn't stop there. Here I was, hundreds upon hundreds of pulls spent on this banner, and with everything on the line, I started my second 10 roll. The first 3 rolls go by with not much happening. On the 4th roll though, I finally saw it again. Gold orbs, followed by that same gold caster card I saw on the very first roll of this entire banner. The card turned and revealed itself, but instead of Skadi, it was a 4-star, Edison. I was absolutely devastated, but the 10 roll didn't stop there. The 5th roll passed without much fanfare, but the 6th, that gave me rainbow orbs, a guaranteed 5-star, and I was hopeful, like surely after all this pain, this was it. I'd finally gotten the one 5-star that I was actually rolling for. It revealed itself, and it was a Berserker, a completely different class, making it my 8th 5-star to not be the rate up, or in other words, a 0.007% chance of happening. At this point, I was done. I tapped the screen to skip the rest of the multi. I'd had enough. Even though I still had more currency left in the last pack that I just bought, I just didn't want to roll more. But after tapping to skip, there she was, Skadi. 8 5-stars, countless 4-stars, hundreds upon hundreds of dollars spent, and at the point where I'd completely given up hope, she finally showed up. From the pure despair when seeing that gold caster card turning into a 4-star, to the rainbow orbs bringing me hope, to the immediate fall from that high when I saw that it wasn't the right character again, to finally, after so many rolls hitting the character, I genuinely don't think I've had a bigger roller coaster of an experience ever. I sometimes still think about the way that final skip where I got Skadi made me feel, and to be honest with you, to this day, I genuinely don't even know how to describe it. Was it relief, despair, happiness? Honestly, I don't even know, and that's why it was such a memorable experience, even if it was bad. Again, similar to the Wander situation, I was still getting 5-stars, and realistically, I probably should have been happy with that, but they weren't what I was actually rolling for, and that just never feels great. So, while that might have been my biggest roller coaster of emotions while rolling, I do actually have one more session that was kind of more comical than anything, and also tangentially related to the pity situation in FGO. For those of you that don't remember, Genshin used to not have any pity either, or at least it didn't on its weapon banner. I'm sure most of us older Genshin players remember when a certain Baldy went super deep going for the Staff of Homa.
We're going to bring it home, right?
But he wasn't actually the only one that had to deal with that. I did as well. While I didn't spend nearly $2,000 like Tectone did, I did get pretty up there myself on one banner, and it was also the first time I'd ever rolled on the weapon banner. This scenario happened during Eula's first release, all the way back in version 1.5. Prior to rolling for Eula, the last time I rolled was Ganyu, all the way back in 1.2, because there weren't really any characters that interested me. So by the time Eula's banner came around, I not only had a good amount of free currency, but I was also more than willing to jump in and spend my currency on her. Starting off, I rolled for and got Eula, and after getting her, I still had a ton of primos left to use. So I did some research and decided to go for her signature Claymore, as that would allow me to use the only other decent weapon of that type that I had, which was the Battle Pass weapon, on another character called Beto. So I jumped into the banner. Being an FGO player, I'd faced banners with no pity before, and hell, I just told you about the worst experience I've ever had with it, so surely nothing could come close, right? Well, I wish I considered that a bit more, because this one didn't go so well for me. For those unfamiliar with the old Genshin banner system, when I say it didn't have pity, I mean pity for the specific weapon you wanted, because all Genshin weapon banners have 2 weapons on them. For example, a Claymore might run with a spear. Soft pity did still exist, so you knew you were going to hit a 5-star after a certain amount of rolls, but it was never guaranteed that you'd get any specific one. As you rolled on them and eventually hit your 5-star, you would have a 75% chance of getting one of the 2 banner weapons and a 25% chance of hitting an off-banner weapon from the standard pool. But even winning the 75-25 didn't mean I'd get the one I wanted, which in my case was Eula's Claymore. You could technically infinitely roll in that banner, winning the 75-25 every single time and only get the second weapon that was running with it. And if you haven't gotten the idea so far, that's exactly what happened to me. Like, this banner not only screwed me in terms of actually getting Eula's Claymore, but also in terms of just getting 5 stars. This was forever ago at this point, but I still remember going beyond soft pity almost every single time, which meant each weapon I pulled was around 70 pulls each. No earlies, no doubles, just pain and losses. On this banner, not only did I keep losing to the second weapon that was on it, I even lost the 75-25 a few times to get completely off-rate weapons too. I jumped in and I came out many 5 stars later with a hell of a lot of swords, a couple books, and even a spear, but only 1 Claymore, and close to 80,000 Primogems poorer. For those of you that don't know the money conversion, that's nearly $1,000. Again, while I did have a lot of free currency available going into the banner, it never feels great spending that much all to get 1 copy. But if you remember, I said this one was kinda comical, and that's for 2 reasons. For one, remember how I kinda brushed off the Battle Pass weapon from earlier as, oh, I could use that on someone else? Yeah, well, it turns out the stuff that I looked at to get damage comparisons on was completely wrong, and instead of being a 15% or more damage increase of the Battle Pass weapon, it was as small as a 4% increase. You heard that right. I spent the equivalent of nearly $1,000 for a 4% damage increase. Go me, man. But that's not all. Less than 2 months after I rolled that weapon, the 2.0 livestream happened. In that stream, something was announced mostly attributed to that baldy and shining armor from earlier, and that was the Epitomized Path. The Epitomized Path guaranteed you whatever weapon you wanted from the banner you were rolling after you lost twice. So, not only did I spend that much currency for a tiny increase in damage over a weapon I already had and realistically could have shared, the entire system got reworked less than 2 months later, and I could have gotten it for less than half the price on our next rerun. That is just so awesome. So anyway, those are my stories, and I appreciate you listening to them if you made it this far. Maybe you'll find them funny, maybe you'll find them sad, but hey, if I can talk about them like this now and make some jokes about it, then it wasn't all that bad. If you have your own experiences you'd like to share, feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link in the description to talk with me about it. As always, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and maybe give my other videos a shot too.